At 8:47 p.m. on January 29, 2025, the skies over the Potomac River became the site of the deadliest U.S. aviation disaster since 2001. Just half a mile from the runway at Reagan National Airport, two aircraft collided in midair at an altitude of barely 300 feet. The crash killed all 67 people on board both aircraft instantly. But the tragedy wasn't just a sudden accident. It was the result of a trap set by years of systemic failures. Involved were a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter operating as a priority air transport flight during a routine night vision evaluation with a crew of 3, an American Airlines Flight 5342, a regional jet carrying 64 people finally coming home on a direct flight from Wichita, Kansas. Inside the cockpit of Flight 5342 was Captain Jonathan Campos, a 34-year-old pilot with nearly 4,000 flight hours and more than 3,000 on the Canadair regional jet. Calm, experienced, and trusted, he was flying the aircraft on what should have been another routine arrival into Washington. Beside him sat First Officer Samuel Lely, just 28 years old. Though early in his airline career, he had already logged more than 2,400 flight hours and was steadily building a promising future in commercial aviation. Just a short distance away, aboard the U.S. Army Black Hawk, Captain Rebecca Lobos was at the controls during her annual night flight evaluation. Monitoring the mission was Chief Warrant Officer Andrew Eves, an experienced evaluator responsible for communications with air traffic control. Completing the crew was Staff Sergeant Ryan O'Hara, the helicopter's crew chief, with over 1,100 hours of experience on the Black Hawk. 7 highly trained aviation professionals, 2 aircraft, 1 ordinary night that within seconds would become one of the darkest chapters in modern American aviation. At approximately 8:43 p.m. Eastern Time, American Airlines Flight 5342 was approaching Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport after a routine flight from Wichita, Kansas. The aircraft was initially cleared for a visual approach to runway 1. But moments later, air traffic control asked the crew if they could switch to runway 33, a different landing path that would take the aircraft over the Potomac River. The crew accepted the change and began repositioning the aircraft for the new approach. At the same time, a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter was flying along an established helicopter route near the river, moving through the busy airspace surrounding the airport. The 2 aircraft were now operating in the same area of sky, near one of the most complex airspaces in the United States. At approximately 8:46 p.m., air traffic control alerted the helicopter crew about a CRJ-700 aircraft operating near runway 33. The helicopter crew responded that they had the aircraft in sight and requested visual separation, meaning they believed they could maintain safe distance from the airplane on their own. But investigators would later focus on one critical question: did the helicopter crew actually identify the correct aircraft? As Flight 5342 continued its final approach, both aircraft moved closer toward the same point above the Potomac River. Just 20 seconds before the collision, the controller again asked the helicopter crew if they had the CRJ in sight. At nearly the same moment, the airliner received an automatic traffic alert from its collision avoidance system. Inside the cockpit, the pilots heard the warning: "Traffic, traffic." However, because the aircraft was already at a very low altitude during the landing phase, the system could not provide automatic climb or descent instructions. Seconds later, the controller instructed the helicopter to pass behind the approaching jet. But there was no time left. At 8:47:59 p.m., the 2 aircraft collided in midair at an altitude of approximately 278 feet above the Potomac River. The impact destroyed both aircraft, sending wreckage into the dark waters below. In just a few seconds, What began as a routine approach to one of America's busiest airports became one of the deadliest aviation disasters in recent history. And investigators were left with a difficult question. How did two aircraft, operating under the control of experienced crews and air traffic controllers, end up occupying the same piece of sky at the same moment?
Most of you say Route versus Zone 6. Most 7 approved.
Good evening, Air 1's with you. Single medevac helicopter 1,000 feet, 2991 on the altimeter. Requesting Zone 6 for Fairfax.
Medevac Air 1, Washington Star, National Altimeter 2990. Approved through Washington class Rover Space 4 landing straight at Fairfax.
2990 for Air 1, copy.
Pad 25, get the CRJ in flight. Pad 25, pass bond is CRJ.
As emergency crews searched the freezing waters of the Potomac River through the night, hope slowly faded. Within hours, the rescue mission became a recovery operation. All 67 people aboard both aircraft had lost their lives, making it the deadliest commercial aviation accident in the United States since 2001. Behind every name was a story. There were families returning home, business travelers, dedicated flight attendants, experienced pilots, military service members, young athletes, coaches, and people simply looking forward to seeing loved ones again. Among the victims was a close-knit group of 7 lifelong friends from Southern Maryland. They were members of the same Plumbers and Steamfitters Union, who had spent several days together on an annual duck hunting trip in Kansas. It was a tradition built on decades of friendship. As they boarded Flight 5342 for the journey home, they exchanged ordinary text messages with their wives. Boarded. See you soon. Love you. None of them knew those would be their final words. When Flight 5342 never arrived, 7 wives waited for phone calls that would never come. In a single night, 7 families from one small community lost their husbands, fathers, and lifelong friends. Their story became a powerful symbol of the human cost of this tragedy. But they were only part of a much larger loss. 67 lives were gone. Dozens of families were left grieving. Birthdays would pass with empty chairs, children would grow up without parents, parents would bury their sons and daughters, friends, co-workers, teammates, and entire communities were left searching for answers. For investigators at the National Transportation Safety Board, honoring those lives meant finding the truth. Not just what happened, but why it happened, and how a tragedy like this could be prevented from ever happening again. In the weeks that followed, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board began reconstructing the final moments of Flight 5342. Divers recovered both aircraft's flight recorders from the icy waters of the Potomac River. Every radio transmission, radar track, cockpit conversation, and fragment of wreckage was examined to answer one question. How could this happen? What investigators uncovered was not a single mistake, but a series of safety failures that had been building for years. The Black Hawk was flying at approximately 278 feet, even though helicopters on that route were expected to remain at or below 200 feet. Investigators also discovered that parts of 2 critical air traffic control transmissions may never have reached the helicopter crew because the radio calls overlapped. At the same time, the controller was handling both helicopter and local air traffic, a staffing arrangement considered unusual for that time of day. Then came one of the investigation's most alarming discoveries. The NTSB reviewed years of safety data and found more than 15,000 close encounters between helicopters and commercial aircraft near Reagan National Airport since 2021. The warning signs had been there, but the system never changed. In its final report, the NTSB concluded that the tragedy was caused by multiple systemic failures: a helicopter route placed dangerously close to the approach path for runway 33, an over-reliance on visual separation, shortcomings in air traffic control, and the helicopter operating above its published altitude. To prevent another disaster, the board issued 50 safety recommendations, including redesigning helicopter routes, improving controller workload management, strengthening communication procedures, and using safety data more effectively to identify risks before lives are lost. Every aviation regulation written today is often paid for by lessons learned yesterday. The legacy of Flight 5342 is not only the 67 lives that were lost, but the changes made to ensure that future passengers and crews never face the same fate. If you found this documentary informative, please support our work by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know.